Hello everyone, I'm your host, Dirty McDirtface, bringing you the deranged ravings of a madman, and you're listening to the Dirt On Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing The Call of Cthulhu, a seminal horror short story by famed American writer H.P. Lovecraft, which was written in the summer of 1926 and published in Weird Tales magazine in February of 1928. Alright, enough of that announcer voice. I think we can drop the act here. So, I wanted to discuss this story mainly because I have been a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft's work for a very long time. I recall I learned about him actually from the video game Terraria, which I played very often during my during my younger years, and which contains a very significant amount of references to his work, Cthulhu in particular, and I recall I believe my dad actually got me a book of his short stories for Christmas when I was like 10 years old, probably, which I wish I still had, but unfortunately I do not. I believe the Call of Cthulhu was in there. I don't know if I actually read it when I was 10 years old, but I have read it a few times. And I chose this story in particular because, well, mainly it is Lovecraft's most famous story, obviously, though it is not actually my favorite one of his stories. I will concede it is probably the best of his short stories, insofar as it has had the most significant impact on the field of literature. But I do not think it is actually my favorite one. I think my favorite would be Pickman's Model, because that one actually managed to unsettle me, which this one was not as effective in doing. But it is the most... It is the most Lovecraft of Lovecraft stories, because, for one, it's got it all. It's got all the... It hits all the classic Lovecraft story beats. I mean, you have the tentacled monsters, you have the cultists, you have the non-Euclidean geometry, you have people going insane from learning some horrible truth about the universe. And partly because of that, it essentially codified the cosmic horror, the cosmic subgenre of horror, which, for those who don't know, is basically, it's focused less on, like, the sort of stuff you would see in Hollywood, where you have, you know, like the Jason Voorhees type of horror, where you just have some fairly mundane threat to the protagonists. This is more focused on the universe itself, and the idea that there is some sort of... essentially that human beings are dramatically inferior to some sort of cosmic entity that is just gonna pave right over us, and there's nothing we or anyone can do to stop it. And for that reason, it is Lovecraft's most famous story. And so, I believe that we shall begin our explanation of it. So, this story is divided into 3 chapters, and it is presented as a manuscript taken from the belongings of one Francis Wayland Thurston, a Boston citizen who is dead by the time the story has been published. And the first chapter is titled The Horror in Clay, and it opens with the now famous lines, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation, or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." So, a couple things we see here. For one, we have the classic Lovecraft gimmick, where what he'll do is he'll take the story and he'll open it with a paragraph on philosophy, which can be read as like just like padding, if you want to take the most uncharitable view possible, if you want to look at it that way. But I think is a very intriguing way to start, because it allows you to get an idea of what the story is saying without like plunging you directly into the action. So it sort of sets the stage. Another thing we notice here is the very flowery, poetic style that is used in this opening paragraph, and which Lovecraft was sort of known for. You'll see in the excerpt later on that there are a lot of adjectives that our boy likes to pile onto his descriptions, and this is known as purple prose, and it is often cited as like as being a problem in literature, because the prevailing literary orthodoxy of the 21st century is essentially that you are supposed to eradicate every adjective that is not strictly necessary to convey what it is that you're trying to describe. And basically you have to write like Ernest Hemingway, who will write like, he went to the river was there, and you write in like this sort of very fragmented, very just like dull, mundane style, where you write everything as if it's just like your diary, basically. And as a result of that, the flowery language has become sort of a lost art. And I think this is very unfortunate, because I have always thought, well, not always, but I have thought for quite some time that the purple style of writing, which was basically in vogue during Lovecraft's day, is a much more exciting style of writing than is the drab, mundane prose that you see writers use nowadays, which is just like regular old sentences. Like, it's just not, it's like, where's the pizzazz? Where's the pizzazz of modern literature? And another thing that we notice in this opening paragraph is it touches on the recurring Lovecraft theme of forbidden knowledge. And this is something that comes up a lot in Lovecraft stories. For example, you have The Rats in the Walls, where the protagonist discovers the horrible truth about his family tree. You have The Shadow over Innsmouth, where the protagonist discovers the horrible truth about his family tree. You have Facts Concerning the Late Arthur German and His Family, where the protagonist discovers the horrible truth about his family tree. Okay, a lot of Lovecraft stories had to do with the protagonist discovering a horrible truth about his family tree. And so this is something that Lovecraft touched on often in his stories. There's some sort of secret that is learned by the protagonist, and which drives him, I don't want to say to the point of madness, because that's a common misconception about Lovecraft, that all his stories end with the protagonist going insane. But it at the very least severely shakes the protagonist learning of this knowledge that was not meant to be learned, essentially. Another example is in the Statement of Randolph Carter, which has some paragraph I can't recall exactly, but it does touch on this topic. So the story proper opens with the protagonist explaining, with Francis Wayland Thurston explaining that he recently lost his granduncle, George Gamble Angell, who was the professor emeritus of Semitic languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Of course, it is Providence, because that's where Lovecraft was born, and he really loved that town, so naturally he liked to use it a lot in his stories. And we are presented with the official prevailing narrative surrounding Angell's cause of death. and Thurston's own speculation regarding it, which goes, locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer dark courts on the precipitous hillside, which formed a short cut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in Williams Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. So, what we have going on here is the protagonist puts forward an alternative theory as to the cause of George Gamble Angel's death. And this is part of a strategy that Lovecraft uses during this during this story, which is he will give you little pieces of information that allow you to see a very small portion of the big picture of what's going on with the plot of the story, and it's just enough to have you guessing, but it doesn't tell you, like, it's just enough to give you an idea in your head of what could be going on, but it's not enough to actually establish straight up what exactly is going on, which he does very well in this story. And we will see later that the significance of what Lovecraft calls the nautical-looking Negro, 1920s, if you're wondering about the usage of that particular term. So, following this event, Thurston goes through Angel's belongings, and because Angel had died as a widower with no children, so Thurston was appointed to be the executor of his will. And among these belongings, he finds a box, which he has a very tough time opening, but he does finally get it open, and one thing that he finds within this box is a bas-relief depicting a rather strange image, to say the least, which he describes. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. So he sees that in the box, and this is another tactic that Lovecraft uses of gradually revealing information. He shows us a little depiction of Cthulhu that gives us some basic details to go off of as to what he looks like. You know, he says here it looks like a cross between an octopus, a dragon, and a human. Pulpy, tentacled head, grotesque, scaly body, rudimentary wings. So we have just enough information here to get sort of a general vibe as to what this monster exactly looks like, but we do not actually, it's not detailed enough to where we are able to actually see the monster really for ourselves. So we sort of have a gradual revealing of information. Now, another interesting thing that he finds within this box is he finds Professor Angel's manuscript, which contains a series of notes on something that the professor terms the Cthulhu cult. And the most interesting of these, which Thurston describes for us, is his encounter with Henry Anthony Wilcox, a young sculptor living at the Fleur-de-Lis building, who has been shunned by the Providence Art Club thanks to his curious antics. And so Wilcox goes off to Wilcox presents Angel with with this bas relief, and he essentially asks him to help him figure out where the archaeological origins of the bas relief. And Angel points out that the bas relief is clearly new, to which Wilcox responds, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." Now this is interesting because this particular tidbit was derived from a dream that H.P. Lovecraft had, where he had sculpted a bas relief and he was trying to sell it to an antiquity museum, and the curator was like, "Dude, what is this? This is you clearly made this." To which he replied, "Why do you say that this thing is new? The dreams of men are older than brooding Egypt or the contemplative Sphinx or garden-girdled Babylon, and this was fashioned in my dreams." Which is a very interesting sentence because it shows that Lovecraft did not write this way, he actually talked this way as well, which is very impressive. Now, this was not uncommon for H.P. Lovecraft. He was often stricken with very disturbing dreams, which he would sometimes use as inspiration for his stories. For example, the Statement of Randolph Carter, which I mentioned earlier, was essentially a word-for-word recreation of a dream that he had involving him and his friend Donald Loveman going to a cemetery late at night, and interesting things happening involving Loveman attempting to dig into a tomb and being killed, presumably by some nameless thing lurking inside it. And the prevalence of Lovecraft's disturbing dreams do, I think, provide an interesting insight into his psyche, because this was a guy who had lived a very bleak life, considering he drifted in and out of poverty a lot, and so he sort of probably from his experiences throughout his life developed a sort of some level of anxiety, which he did have. He did suffer from anxiety quite a bit, and that probably did have to do with his choosing to write horror fiction. So anyway, Wilcox describes his dream as follows. Upon retiring, he had had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fatagan. Now, this shows us our first glimpse of the sunken city of Rolier, which is where Cthulhu lives, and which will actually appear in the story later on, at the very end, in fact. And so Angel and Wilcox continue meeting, and Wilcox continues to describe his strange dreams to Angel, until at one point Wilcox has a nightmare involving a gigantic thing miles high, which walked or lumbered about. And this dream, it was apparently so terrible that he fell into an actual fever as a result. So, I mean, you've heard of fevers causing people to have weird dreams. This guy had a weird dream that caused him to have a fever. So, interestingly, only a few days after this, Wilcox suddenly bolts upright in bed and has lost all memory of the entire affair. And as a result of this, Angel chooses to continue polling his friends on the sorts of dreams they're having. Most of them have not much interesting to record about them, but the artists and the poets have some very interesting dreams indeed. Which is an interesting detail. I would say it is probably because they are sort of in touch with an ineffable essence, or maybe it's just that they have more vivid imaginations that Cthulhu's psychic magic basically is able to work with. And this is illustrated, I think, with a sentence from Pickman's Model, another story by H.P. Lovecraft, which goes, "There's something those fellows catch beyond life that they're able to make us catch for a moment." And that, I think, is the reason why artists are the most affected out of all the groups he surveyed, which included businessmen and scientists. One story which Thurston relates to us from from Angel's manuscript was a story about a man who, on the day Wilcox suffered his fever, went violently insane and had to be incarcerated in a mental asylum as a result of him screaming about an escaped denizen of hell, and months later died, I believe from a heart attack. I don't remember exactly, but I do believe it was a heart attack. And following this, it is revealed that this is really a worldwide phenomenon. This these strange dreams people are having, which Thurston describes as follows: "Professor Angel must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here likewise a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd to 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendry, and a fantastic painter named Ardois Bonneau hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions." So this is where chapter 1 of the Call of Cthulhu ends, and we are left from this with a sense that there is some sort of mystery going on. There's something going on with people's dreams all throughout the world, all having to do with this great monster and this great city that presumably cannot be some kind of coincidence, but at the same time, it is not clear exactly what the cause of these dreams is, and so this sort of forms the crux of the mystery in the Call of Cthulhu. And some of this information is later revealed to us in the second chapter of the story, which is The Tale of Inspector Legrasse. Now, this chapter introduces us to the character of John Raymond Legrasse. Now, John Raymond Legrasse is from New Orleans, and he is introduced as being an inspector of police. And so he goes to a meeting of the American Archaeological Society in 1908, and which George Gamble Angel is attending, and he presents them with a statuette that he would very much like for them to explain to him where exactly it's from. And so that statuette is described as being a very mysterious thing. No one can really, no one can actually, even among these scholarly, learned archaeologists, no one can identify where this thing is from, with one exception, which we'll see later. and that is described thusly. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting, and so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled upon a dark cult totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered, hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. Now, following that, we are presented with an actual description of the statuette, which just so happens to rather line up with Thurston's description of the bas-relief, and this is the second description we get of what Cthulhu looks like, and it is a more detailed description than Thurston's description of the bas-relief, which is another part of how Lovecraft sort of gradually increases the level of detail that we have fed to us about our villain, as it were. And that description goes, "It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block, the seat occupied the center, whilst the long, curved claws of the doubled-up, crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward, so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of huge forepaws, which clasped the croucher's elevated knees." So that is our first real description of what Cthulhu looks like. That isn't just it was a mixture of an octopus, a dragon, and a human, and it was real scary looking. It's so we see from that we have more description given to us as to what this thing really looks like. And interestingly, it is hinted that this little statuette was in fact not created by humans. Or not even hinted, really. It's more actually it's really more stated, actually. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, for the soapy, greenish-black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and our conceptions have no part. Now, obviously, none of the archaeologists who are exposed to this thing have any idea at all what it could possibly be, with one notable exception. The exception of a gentleman by the name of Professor William Channing Webb, who has returned from Greenland, a tour of Greenland and Iceland, during which he had a very interesting, or not recently returned, it was 48 years ago by the time the story begins, that he went on this tour. But he went on a tour of Greenland and Iceland, during which he encountered a cult of Eskimos who just happened to have with them a statuette resembling exactly the one that Inspector Legras has presented the Archaeological Society with. Professor Webb had been engaged, 48 years before, in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast, had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimos whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Eskimos knew little, in which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come down from horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil or tornasuk, and of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged angakok or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing, and as far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. Now, naturally, John Raymond LaGrasse is quite intrigued by this, and so these two guys exchange information with each other, which results in quite an interesting discovery, namely that these two cults, the one, the Eskimo cult that Professor Webb found in Greenland, and the swamp cult that LaGrasse found in Louisiana, just so happened to have the exact same chant. These data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector LaGrasse, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolist Eskimos. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really awed silence, when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. What, in substance, both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this, the word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud. Funglui Magruanaf Cthulhu Relie Woganagal Fatagan, which is translated into English as, in his house at Rolier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. The exact language is not specified. Following this, Inspector LaGrasse begins to relate to us his story, which describes how he and a company of 20 policemen, or 19 policemen, not counting him, went out into the swamps of Louisiana with the goal of taking down a cult that the locals had accused of being responsible for the kidnapping of local women and children. And the description of this event is a very powerful example of H.P. Lovecraft's spectacular talent at imagery, because when you read this passage that I will soon read for you here, you can really picture in your mind exactly what this scene looks like, and it's very vivid. And it goes like this. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones of fragments of a rotting wall, intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship, so Inspector LaGrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. Now that right there that is undeniably an incredible description. Now, there are people who say that Lovecraft was. I don't think this is actually a very common thing for people to believe, but I have heard it said, or read it said on the internet at least, that Lovecraft was good at coming up with ideas, but not good at writing, which is simply not true, as evidenced by this passage here. I mean, you can really picture in your head this scene of the Spanish moss hanging down from the trees, and the stones on the ground, and the little mud huts that the local people are living in. You can get you get a very clear image in your mind of what this scene looks like, and it's very well done. It's extremely vivid. Following this, the cops arrive at the scene of a cult ritual, in which the cultists are described almost like animals, essentially, because they are described as being bestial, not even human, really. And part of this maybe has to do with Lovecraft's negative opinion of various ethnicities, but it also ties into a recurring theme in Lovecraft's stories, which I'll come back to later, but is the struggle between civilization and savagery. So these cultists, they're described as acting in an animalistic way, making animalistic sounds, in fact. One sentence goes something along the lines of, there are noises peculiar to men and noises peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. The assumption there being that these are human beings making sounds that sound like the sounds that animals make. So these cultists are described basically as being like degraded human beings to the level that they are basically animalistic. And this paints a very neat picture of Lovecraft's recurring theme of civilization and savagery, which we will, as I said, discuss more soon enough. And so the scene of this horrific event is described thusly. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous in its diminutiveness, rested the noxious carven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals, with the flame-girt monolith as a center, hung, head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right in endless bacchanals between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. So, we have another stellar image of Lovecraft's another stellar example, of Lovecraft's great talent in imagery. We get from this a very vivid picture of what this cult ritual looks like in this human sacrifice, and it is quite an unnerving mental image. This picture of these savage cultists prancing about this bonfire, letting out unhinged cries with these dead bodies hanging down from 10 scaffolds that they've set up above the fire, just like dancing about in a scene of revelry. And so it's very descriptive. And it does bring to mind, as I said, a very strong mental image. So, the police initially are so horrified by this event that they are frozen in shock. And now this is certainly saying something, because these are policemen who presumably have seen quite a bit of stuff in their day. So the fact that this scene is too much for them really says a lot. So following this, though, they do get over it, and there's a firefight between the policemen and the cultists, which the police win easily because the cultists have no firearms with them. So, kind of an easy battle. And so the cultists are very quickly taken into custody. And it is here that a description of the sort of motley crew that makes up this cult is given to us. It is said that only 2 of the cultists were actually declared to be sane and were able, therefore, to be hanged. And the entire rest of the cult was found to be completely insane and thus had to be committed to mental asylums. And it is through this scene as well that we are presented with an explanation of what exactly it is that these cultists believe. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea. But their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first man, who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Rillier under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Some day he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Now, one thing that I noticed about when I was reading these passages about about what exactly the cult believes is that it sort of reminds me almost of like a bizarre, warped parody of Christianity. Now, as those of you who know me in person, which is all of you who are going to be listening to this podcast, as those of you who know me in person know, I'm a Christian, and I cannot help but see some things that our religion teaches reflected in a very warped and disturbing way in the description of what the cult teaches. For instance, there's an emphasis on apocalypticism in the Cthulhu cult. Christianity, for example, teaches that Jesus Christ will one day return and rule the world, and the Cthulhu cult teaches that Cthulhu will one day return and rule the world, which is just one of the similarities. The similarities mainly have to do with the apocalypticism, and it's sort of inverted the moral compass of Christianity and the Cthulhu cult, because Christianity has very strict moral guidelines, whereas the Cthulhu cult actually, their goal, as we'll see later, is essentially to create a world where everyone can do absolutely anything that they want. And this is explained to us by a high-ranking figure within the cult, a very old mestizo man by the name of Castro, who explains that the cult believes, essentially, that the world was at one point ruled by these great old ones, and that the great old ones are now living sort of underneath, sort of inside of the earth and underneath the ocean, and that they will one day rise again as a result of the cult's meddling, that the cult basically needs to conduct rituals in order to liberate the great old ones who are currently dormant, so that the great old ones may one day rule the world again. And the cultists benefit from that, because that cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. So essentially the cultists believe that the world they want the world to become a sort of a place where anyone can do absolutely anything they want, up to and including murder, just because they want to do it. Essentially, that essentially is the cult's goal. They want a world where they can do absolutely anything they like, and they are willing to help get the great old ones released from their subterranean and underwater tombs in order to achieve that vision of the world. Now, obviously, this is a vision of the world that only an insane person could accept, which is presumably why the cult is composed exclusively of crazy people. And it is, as I said before, it presents us with with another one of Lovecraft's recurring themes, which is the conflict between civilization and savagery. Another example of this is The Picture in the House, another story that he wrote, in which a genealogist is biking through a forest not a forest, a valley in New England, through the Miskatonic Valley, which H.P. Lovecraft invented. And he happens to be driven into a apparently abandoned cabin by heavy rain, only to discover that it in fact is not abandoned and is occupied by a very, very old and dirty-looking man who happens to have a taste for human flesh. So that's another example of this theme. We have there the urban gentleman, the scholarly gentleman who happens to, by misfortune, delve into the savage realms of depravity and decadence. And now this is something that was very important to H.P. Lovecraft, because he believed that he believed very firmly that society as a whole was degrading from its former state. He was sort of he had very old-fashioned views about just about everything, and he was of the firm belief that Western civilization was sort of deteriorating into some sort of some sort of inferior form, which had to do with race mixing, because he believed that he did believe that white people were more civilized than other races, which was a fairly common viewpoint at the time, but also had to do with just physical, mental, and moral degradation in general, including through depraved acts, such as the ones depicted in some of his stories, which depict, on occasion, various depravities such as incest or cannibalism. So he firmly believed that civilization as a whole was deteriorating. I have to wonder what he would think about the 21st century. I mean, I myself became quite convinced that society is degrading after prom night this year, but that's a story for another time. And so this was something that was very important to Lovecraft, at least during the stage in his life where he was writing this story. He did sort of change his viewpoints later on. He did become much more he did adopt a rather more left-wing view of the world during his later life, and became a supporter of FDR after having had a brief stint of sympathizing with Hitler, funnily enough, though he didn't really particularly like National Socialism. He just sort of had some sympathies for it. And so this is another instance of this story contains a very clear instance of this theme of civilization versus savagery. It's embodied sort of between embodied in the clash here between the urban policemen and the urban policemen who are all lily white essentially, and the cultists in the swamps of Louisiana, the Louisiana swamp priests, who are described as being very racially mixed and are sort of portrayed as being essentially completely depraved, basically, and acting in these very unhinged ways. So that's another instance of the recurring theme of civilization versus savagery. And this particular element of the cult beliefs that that one day the great old ones will rise again and then take over the world again and set everyone free to do whatever it is they please. This is also an element that the Cthulhu cult has in common with a sort of a warped version of Christianity, because Christianity teaches that at the end of the world there will be a millennium where Jesus Christ will rule the world for 1,000 years, and the world will sort of be restored to the way that it was during the period during the Garden of Eden, before Adam and Eve sinned and evil entered the world. Meanwhile, the Cthulhu cult teaches that the release of the Great Old Ones will result in the creation of a global state where people are able to do whatever it is they please with no possible consequences for anybody. And so we have sort of a warped version in the Cthulhu cult of the teachings of Christianity regarding the millennial, the millennium, and the restoration of the earth to a former, better way after a grand apocalyptic event. And so I think that is also a fairly interesting dimension. So Thurston, after hearing of this story, after learning of this story, he decides to go talk to Wilcox himself, because he at this point is still firmly convinced that there's nothing supernatural going on here. And so he's sure, basically, that Wilcox was just basically trolling George Gamble Angel for some reason. And so he goes up to the Fleur-de-Lis building, and he goes to meet with Wilcox. And during this meeting, he becomes convinced that the sculptor is actually completely sincere. Like, he was not just trolling Professor Angel. He was actually being genuinely completely serious in describing his dreams. And those same dreams are described in this sentence here. He talked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong, and hear with frightened expectancy the ceaseless, half-mental calling from underground, Cthulhu Fatagan, Cthulhu Fatagan. Now, Thurston, he goes home after this, and he is still at this point trying to invent rational explanations as to how all this could possibly be occurring. He invents this theory, sort of, that Wilcox had somehow heard about the cult, despite the fact that the cult is top secret, basically, and then forgot about the cult and had dreams pertaining to its teachings. So what we have here is sort of a classic horror trope where we have the protagonist just refusing to acknowledge that something supernatural is going on until it is just staring him right in the face, until he has absolutely no other choice than to accept maybe there's something weird going on here. And this is another interesting dimension, because this does not really reflect H.P. Lovecraft's personal views at all, because Lovecraft himself was an atheist, and he was, as a result, a materialist, and was very supportive of the modern scientific advancements that were taking place during his time period. Yet his fiction was absolutely not. His fiction did not, in any sense, laud science, the scientific advancements that were being made during Lovecraft's day, but instead sort of condemned them almost as being responsible for the revelation of knowledge that was meant to be kept secret, and so that's something that's quite interesting. The disconnect between Lovecraft's actual personal beliefs and what happens in his fiction. So it's around this point that Thurston shares his theory that George Gamble Angel was in fact not killed as a result of just a heart attack, but had actually been murdered, and that theory is described like this. One thing which I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels after a careless push from a Negro sailor. I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and as anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legras and his men, it is true, have been let alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculptor's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angel died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now. And yes, seeing as it was established earlier in the earlier in the story that our narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, is in fact dead by the time these papers have been published, it is implied that Thurston, in fact, was killed by the cultists. And now we come to the final chapter of the Call of Cthulhu, which is titled "The Madness from the Sea." And now, before we actually get into the story described in The Madness from the Sea, I want to talk a bit about why most likely Lovecraft chose the ocean as the setting for this particular the climax of this story. Now, H.P. Lovecraft was afraid of a number of things. He was afraid, most of all, of the ocean, which was quite amusingly described in an anecdote from a book written by two contemporaries of Lovecraft, two friends of his, August Derleth and Donald Wandrei. Now, this story was, I believe it was written by August Derleth and by Derleth and Wandrei. It may have just been Wandrei. I can't recall exactly, but this story was related by Donald Wandrei, another writer who was friends with Lovecraft and who mainly wrote fantasy and sci-fi. And in this anecdote, Wandrei explains how Lovecraft and him, or how he and Lovecraft went to a restaurant in Providence by the name of Jake's, and he ordered a swordfish steak, which caused Lovecraft to make a face of visceral disgust. And, of course, Wandrei asked him what that was all about, to which Lovecraft said, "I cannot tolerate seafood in any form. The very sight and smell of it nauseate me. Don't let it disturb you. By all means, consume the horrible stuff. Younger and stronger constitutions than that of the old man can absorb such punishment. But one mouthful would make me actually and violently ill. I have hated fish and feared the sea and everything connected with it since I was 2 years old, but I cannot recall what earlier experience gave me such a profound and lasting aversion to the sea and seafood." So he forgot. He forgot what happened to him. As did Wilcox. Could it perhaps be that Lovecraft went on a cruise or something and ended up encountering Cthulhu? something to think about. Anyway, the anecdote concludes, for himself, he had Boston baked beans with bacon, apple pie with ice cream, and heavily sugared coffee. Which is probably why he ended up dying of intestinal cancer, but I digress. Anyway, so the ocean, I think, really is an excellent place for a horror story to be set. Mainly because more than 90% of the ocean is unexplored. In fact, we've actually explored more of outer space than we have of the ocean, which means that we know very little about the ocean, which means it's a lot more plausible, the idea that there could be some things, some awful, monstrous things lurking deep down in the depths of the ocean. So I think that the ocean is a very good place to set horror stories. Isolated places in general make for great horror locations. Like this, the ocean, beneath the surface of the earth, outer space, even just like the wilderness, just like isolated stretches of wilderness that no one really goes to. These are generally the best places to set horror stories, just because it's a lot more plausible that some sort of hidden evil could be lurking out in a place that no one really goes, than that there's some sort of hidden evil lurking in New York City. Though Lovecraft did have a story about there being a hidden evil in New York City, which I may do on this show, but I think that the ocean, especially among isolated places, is a very good place to set horror stories, which is presumably why this particular location was chosen. So, Chapter 3 begins with Francis Wayland Thurston going off to Paterson, New Jersey to visit a friend who is a museum curator, and he just happens to see a rather curious news article which has a picture of the Cthulhu idol and describes a very interesting story about how the Morrison Company's freighter, a freighter belonging to the Morrison Company by the name of the Vigilant, having a disabled steam yacht by the name of the Alert in tow, arrived in Darling Harbor on the morning of April 18th, 1925, and how there were two men found on board, one alive and one dead. The survivor was found to be carrying what is described as a horrible stone idol of unknown origin, and it is then revealed to us that this survivor is a Norwegian man by the name of Gustav Johansen, who was the second mate of a two-masted schooner called the Emma, which was attacked by the Alert, which is described as having been manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes. For explanation, Kanakas are Pacific Islanders. It's an old term used to describe workers from the Pacific Islands. In the fight, 3 crewmates on the Emma were killed, which led to Johansen assuming control of the ship and trying to steer it back in the original direction. And at the very end or close to the end of the news article, we are presented with a little tidbit that proves to be very significant later on when Johansen's story is actually explained to us in full detail. The next day, it appears, they raised and landed on a small island, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean, and 6 of the men somehow died ashore, though Johansen is queerly reticent about this part of his story, and speaks only of their falling into a rock chasm. Now, Thurston obviously is intrigued by this. By this point, he has sort of given up on his research into the Cthulhu cult, or sort of forgotten about it, but this chance discovery happens to reignite his interest, and so he goes off to Norway to track down Gustav Johansen. He goes to Johansen's address, and he is greeted at the door by a very somber-looking woman who is revealed to be Johansen's wife, and she explains in poor English that Johansen died under mysterious circumstances after having paper dropped on his head from a higher story of a building he was walking next to, and being helped up by two Lascar sailors. And Lascars are sailors from India, Southeast Asia, and Arabia, along with some other location that I don't recall exactly. Now, Thurston is disappointed by the fact that Johansen is dead, but he does manage to get his hands on a manuscript which Johansen wrote in English, which Thurston speculates was done deliberately by Johansen to protect his wife from the truth about exactly what it was that happened at sea that day. And so the manuscript begins with Johansen and his men seeing what is described as a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansen achieved something very close to it when he spoke of the city. For instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells only on the broad impressions of vast angles and stone surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mention his talk about angles because it suggests something Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He had said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now an unlettered seaman felt the same thing whilst gazing at the terrible reality. So, the sailors run aground at R'lyeh, the sunken city of R'lyeh, which has now risen up to the top of the ocean. And so, upon seeing this city that is possessed of geometry that is not possible in this world, what do? But go exploring. So they go to R'lyeh, they begin exploring, and they find something that is described as being like a door. It's described like this. It was, Johansen said, like a great barn door, and they all felt that it was a door because of the ornate lintel, threshold, and jambs around it, though they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trapdoor or slantwise like an outside cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure that the sea and the ground were horizontal, hence the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. But regardless, the men are able to get the door open, and this happens. Poor Johansen's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote of this. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he thinks 2 perished of pure fright in that accursed instant. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God! What wonder that across the earth a great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in that telepathic instant. The thing of the idols, the green sticky spawn of the stars, had awaked to claim his own. The stars were right again, and what an age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After vigintillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again, and ravening for delight. So, here we have it, that the big man himself has just arrived on the scene. The one and only Cthulhu himself has just shown up. So this is the point at which things get really heated, and it is described how Cthulhu attacks the remaining sailors. 3 of them, Donovan, Guerrera, and Angstrom, are said to be swept up in Cthulhu's claws. One man, Parker, trips and falls into what is described as an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there, an angle which was acute, but behaved as if it were obtuse. It is only Gustav Johansen and another member of the crew, William Bryden, who are able to escape to the alert, and Bryden does not survive with his sanity intact. it is said that he looked back and went mad, laughing shrilly as he kept on laughing at intervals, until death found him one night in the cabin whilst Johansen was wandering deliriously. So, this is a horrific scene, clearly. This scene where we have had these sailors, who did not set out, like the cultists did, to cause this catastrophic event. They just did it completely by accident. And now, 6 of them have died of pure fright. Was it 6? No, it was 2. Sorry about that. 2 of them have died of fear. 3 have been swept up in Cthulhu's claws, and 1 has fallen into an impossible angle and been somehow absorbed by it. One wonders what happened to him after that. And it is only these 2 who are able to escape, and one of them does not even make it out sane. He is driven completely bonkers by his experience. So you can really get a feel that this has been a very frightening event for all of them. But then something completely unexpected happens. Something that you would really never expect to happen if you are going just based off the pop cultural assessment of Cthulhu as essentially this sort of unkillable god who, is able to crush cities with a flick of his fingers. That's basically how Cthulhu is presented in popular culture. If you are operating based on that assumption, you will be very surprised by the actual ending of the tale of Gustav Johansen, which goes as follows. But Johansen had not given out yet. Knowing that the thing could surely overtake the Alert until steam was fully up, he resolved on a desperate chance, and, setting the engine for full speed, ran lightning-like on deck and reversed the wheel. There was a mighty eddying and foaming in the noisome brine, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, the brave Norwegian drove his vessel head-on against the pursuing jelly, which rose above the unclean froth like the stern of a demon galleon. The awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansen drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness, a bursting as of an exploding bladder. I'm not sure if I said that right. A slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 opened graves, and a sound that the chronicler would not put on paper. For an instant the ship was befouled by an acrid, blinding green cloud, and then there was only a venomous seething astern, where, God in heaven, the scattered plasticity of that nameless sky spawn was nebulously recombining in its hateful original form, whilst its distance widened every second as the Alert gained impetus from its mounting steam. So what we have just witnessed here is this titanic beast has risen up from the ocean, and these 6 sailors have mostly died. 2 escape, 1 goes insane, and the remaining one takes command of the ship and steers it into the monster's head, cracking its head open, and then he sails away as the monster heals from its injury. Quite an ending, don't you think? And so, the story itself ends with this closing statement from Francis Wayland Thurston. That was the document I read, and now I have placed it in the tin box beside the bas-relief and the papers of Professor Angel. With it shall go this record of mine, this test of my own sanity, wherein is pieced together that which I hope may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. But I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansen went, so I shall go. I know too much, and the cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, again in that chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. His accursed city is sunken once more, for the Vigilance sailed over the spot after the April storm, but his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay around idol-capped monoliths in lonely places. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or else the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think. Let me pray that if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity, and see that it meets no other eye. And so, here's why the ending of the Call of Cthulhu can be interpreted as hopeful. So, for one, the fact remains that even though the cult is still going on, and Cthulhu is still alive, Cthulhu was defeated, at least temporarily. And now as a result of Johansson having rammed a steamboat into his head, and that having had an effect, that having successfully subdued him for the time being at least, the manner in which Cthulhu can be defeated, if and when he rises again, has been established. Just ram a steamboat into his head. So, if a schedule can be worked out as to when exactly Cthulhu is supposed to rise again, we could just ram a steamboat into his head, and we'll basically be fine. In fact, given the time that this story was written in the 1920s, a steamboat was basically considered to be the most powerful thing that exists, the most powerful instance of human technology. We have nuclear weapons now, so we have actually managed to go beyond the level of Cthulhu. We have managed now to become, as Old Castro sort of predicted, we have become as the great old ones, if you will. We have managed to create mechanical tools which could, in the event of Cthulhu rising in, easily put him down. And so, even if it came at a severe cost to the crew of the Emma, it still remains that humanity was saved by Cthulhu being hit in the head with that steamboat. Now, there's a common misconception of Lovecraft stories as being essentially completely devoid of all hope, just being these hopeless tales where inevitably the protagonist dies or goes insane. But as we see from this really isn't true at all. Because while it is true that Johansson did die, it was not in the process of putting Cthulhu down. It was after the fact, because he had seen Cthulhu himself, and the cult decided that he could not be allowed to live. So this is actually a victory for humanity against the various eldritch horrors that exist within Lovecraft's universe. There are other examples of this as well, such as in the Dunwich Horror, which I haven't actually read, but I do intend to read at some point. And so a lot of people have this idea that Lovecraft's stories just always end in doom and gloom. And it is true that there is an overarching sense of doom and gloom within Lovecraft stories. But there is, in many of them, something of a glimmer of hope among the shadows that surround the world. So, essentially, The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft is a triumph of the indomitable human spirit over the indifferent cruelty of the universe. That is a sentence that probably has never been spoken before in human history, but it has been spoken now. And that, my friends, is the dirt on The Call of Cthulhu. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all again in the next episode. This has been Dirty McDirtface, and you've been listening to the Dirt On Podcast. Goodbye.